the moment the security guard touched my elbow, I knew something had gone terribly wrong. Not loudly, not with force, just 2 fingers, polite and firm, pressing into the lace sleeve of the dress I'd spent 3 months saving for. The music was still playing behind us, soft piano notes drifting through the ballroom like nothing in the world had shifted, but inside my chest, something cracked so sharply I almost gasped. "Ma'am," he said quietly, leaning in as if this were a kindness, "I'm going to need you to step outside." For a second, I honestly thought he had the wrong person. I looked around, half expecting him to tap someone else instead. My brother's wedding was full of people, family friends, co-workers, cousins I hadn't seen since childhood, women in pastel dresses, men in dark suits that smelled faintly of cologne and nerves. Laughter floated from a nearby table. Someone clinked a glass. "I'm his sister," I whispered, pointing toward the head table where my younger brother sat, smiling, oblivious, his new wife glowing beside him in white. "That's my baby brother." The guard didn't look in that direction. He kept his eyes on mine, steady and uncomfortable. "I understand, but I've been asked to escort you out." Asked? By who? I wanted to scream. By who? But my voice wouldn't come. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears and the sudden, humiliating awareness that people were starting to look. Heads turning, conversations slowing, that awful moment when joy curdles into curiosity. I let him guide me toward the exit, my heels sinking into the carpet with each step, like the floor itself was trying to hold me back. The doors closed behind us with a soft, final thud. Just like that, I was outside my brother's wedding, alone. If you'd asked me a year earlier how this would all end, I would have laughed. Back then, my life was ordinary in the quiet, dependable way I had come to value. I was the oldest sibling, the one who remembered when our mother worked double shifts and our father came home too tired to talk. I learned early how to make dinner stretch, how to keep the peace, how to swallow my feelings so everyone else could breathe easier. My brother, Daniel, was 7 years younger than me. I practically raised him, packed his lunches, helped him with homework at the kitchen table while the radio hummed in the background. When he cried into my shoulder. When he scraped his knee, I was the one who kissed it better. Even after we grew up and went our separate ways, that bond never fully loosened. We talked every Sunday. He'd call me when he was stressed, when work got heavy, when life felt too fast. I knew the sound of his laugh through the phone, knew when something was wrong by the way he said my name. So when he told me he was getting married, I cried right there in my kitchen, standing barefoot on cold tile, the kettle screaming itself dry on the stove. "I want you there," he said. "I need you there." And I believed him. The months leading up to the wedding were busy in that exhausting, hopeful way. Dress fittings, phone calls, last-minute changes. I offered help where I could, reviewing seating charts, addressing invitations, when his fiancée, Marissa, said she was overwhelmed. Marissa. That name still sits heavy in my mouth. She was beautiful in the polished, effortless way that made rooms tilt toward her, always perfectly put together, always smiling, but never quite with her eyes. From the beginning, something about her felt distant, not unkind, just guarded, like someone who'd learned early how to keep their cards close. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, not everyone grows up like we did. Not everyone wears their heart on their sleeve. And Daniel loved her, that much was obvious. He softened around her, leaned in when she spoke, looked at her like she was a promise. So I tried. God knows I tried. I complimented her dress choices, asked about her family, offered to help with the centerpieces. She thanked me politely every time, her smile tight, her hand already halfway back to her phone. There were moments, small ones, that I brushed off too easily. Like the way she corrected me when I told a childhood story about Daniel, her laugh a little sharp, or how she once said, "You're very involved," when I suggested a different song for the mother-son dance, or the time I overheard her on the phone, voice low and tense, saying, "She doesn't need to be everywhere." I pretended I hadn't heard. Because families are complicated, because weddings are stressful, because I didn't want to be that sister, the overbearing one, the jealous one, the problem. So I kept my head down and my heart open. On the morning of the wedding, I arrived early, just like I always did. The venue smelled like fresh flowers and floor polish. Sunlight poured through tall windows, catching dust in the air and turning it into something almost magical. I wore a soft blue dress, modest but elegant, the kind my mother would have approved of. I pinned my hair back with shaking fingers, my reflection older than I remembered, but still hopeful. Daniel hugged me when he saw me. "You made it," he said, as if there had ever been a doubt. "I wouldn't miss this," I told him, and I meant it. Only if I'd known that within a few hours I'd be standing outside those same doors, clutching my purse like a lifeline, wondering how love could turn into exile so quietly. I keep thinking about how normal that morning felt, right up until it didn't. After Daniel hugged me, he was pulled away almost immediately. Groomsmen clapping his back, someone adjusting his tie, another voice calling his name from across the room. He looked happy, the kind of happy that settles into your bones when you believe your life is finally lining up the way it's supposed to. I watched him for a moment longer than necessary, memorizing the slope of his shoulders, the way he laughed with his whole chest. I told myself I was proud. I told myself I was ready to step back. That's what older sisters are supposed to do, right? I wandered toward the side of the room where the women were gathering. Marissa stood near the mirror, surrounded by bridesmaids in matching dresses. Someone was fixing a loose curl near her temple. Another was fussing over the hem of her gown. She looked radiant, truly. The white dress fit her like it had been poured on, clean and sharp and perfect. When she caught my eye in the mirror, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "There you are," she said, turning slightly. "You look nice." It was a polite statement, not a warm one. Still, I nodded, grateful for even that. "Thank you," I said. "You look beautiful." She inclined her head, accepting the compliment the way someone accepts a receipt, briefly, without attachment. Then she turned back to her reflection. I stood there, suddenly unsure what to do with my hands. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of music and vows and soft gasps from the crowd. I cried quietly when Daniel's voice cracked. I clasped my hands together when Marissa said "I do," her voice steady as stone. When they kissed, the room erupted into applause, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt that old familiar warmth, family, love, continuity. At the reception, I took my assigned seat and smoothed my napkin over my lap. I noticed my name card was tucked at the very end of the table, far from Daniel. Not ideal, but weddings were complicated. I shrugged it off. Around me, people laughed and leaned toward each other. The air smelled like roasted chicken and sweet wine. Glasses clinked. A low hum of happiness settled over everything. I tried to relax into it. But little things kept tugging at me. Daniel didn't come over to check on me, not even once. When I caught his eye across the room and lifted my hand in a small wave, he hesitated just a fraction of a second before turning back to someone else. Marissa moved through the room like a queen making rounds, stopping at tables, laughing, touching arms. When she reached ours, she greeted everyone warmly. When she got to me, she paused. "Oh," she said, as if surprised. "I didn't see you there." I smiled. "Congratulations," I said again, softer this time. "Thank you," she replied, already turning away. I told myself not to read into it. I told myself I was tired, emotional, too sensitive. But there was a tightness in my chest that wouldn't ease. After dinner, while guests mingled and the band took a break, I slipped into the hallway near the restrooms, needing air. The carpet muffled my footsteps. The walls were lined with framed photographs of past events, other weddings, other smiling families. I leaned against the cool wall and exhaled. That's when I heard my name. Not spoken loudly, not shouted, just enough to catch. "She shouldn't still be here," a woman's voice said. Marissa's voice. I froze. Another voice murmured something I couldn't make out. "She makes Daniel uncomfortable. I told him this would be an issue. Today is not about her." My stomach dropped. I wanted to step forward, to announce myself, to demand an explanation, but my feet wouldn't move. A pause. "I don't care how it looks. I don't want her here." There was the sound of footsteps moving away. I stood there long after the hallway went quiet, my heart thudding so loudly I was sure someone could hear it. My reflection stared back at me from the glass of a nearby frame, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, like a woman who'd just been slapped without warning. I told myself I must have misunderstood, that stress had sharpened her words, that Daniel would never allow something like that. He loved me, didn't he? When I returned to the ballroom, the mood had shifted. The band was playing again, louder now. People were dancing. The lights had dimmed, casting everything in warm gold. I spotted Daniel near the bar. He was alone, staring into his drink. I took a breath and walked over. "Hey," I said gently. He looked up, and for the first time that day, he didn't smile. "We need to talk," he said. My heart sank. "What's wrong?" I asked, though a part of me already knew. He glanced around, then leaned closer. "Marissa feels like you've been hovering," he chose his words carefully. "She thinks it's making things tense." "Hovering?" I swallowed. "I've barely spoken to her." I know," he said quickly. "I know, but today is a lot. She's overwhelmed." Something in his voice, strained, apologetic, told me he was repeating words that weren't his own. "I heard her," I said quietly. He stiffened. "Heard her say what?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "Never mind." He exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Look, can you give us some space tonight, please?" Space? On his wedding day? I nodded, because that's what I've always done, because pushing would only make things worse, because I loved him too much to turn his happiness into a battlefield. "I'll be fine," I said. He squeezed my arm, relief flooding his face. "Thank you." I watched him walk away, feeling smaller with every step he took. 10 minutes later, the security guard found me, and everything I thought I understood about family shattered at the door. When the guard led me outside, the night air hit my face like a cold truth. The doors closed behind me, muffling the music, the laughter, the life that was supposed to include me. I stood there for a second, blinking under the yellow glow of the parking lot lights, my purse clutched so tightly my fingers ached. "This has to be a mistake," I said, more to myself than to him. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the guard replied, already stepping back. His job was done, so was my place, apparently. I watched him disappear back inside, the door sealing shut with a soft click that felt louder than any shout. For a moment, I just stood there. Cars were parked in neat rows, their metal bodies cooling in the night. Somewhere nearby, crickets chirped. The world kept going, completely unaware that something inside me had just split open. I replayed Daniel's words in my head. "Can you give us some space tonight?" I told myself this was just an extension of that, a misunderstanding taken too far, someone acting on emotion, not instruction. Daniel wouldn't do this to me. He couldn't. I pulled out my phone and texted him. "They just escorted me out. Please tell me this isn't what I think it is." The screen glowed back at me, empty. I waited. Nothing. I tried calling, straight to voicemail. My chest tightened. I could feel every heartbeat heavy and uneven. I thought about walking back inside, demanding answers, marching straight up to Marissa in her perfect white dress and asking her to say it to my face. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the sinking realization that whatever was happening had already been decided without me. I sat down on a low concrete curb and smoothed my dress, the lace now wrinkled at the knees. I must have looked pathetic, an overdressed woman alone in a parking lot, mascara stinging my eyes. I didn't cry, not yet. I waited. Minutes passed, then more. Guests began to trickle out for air or cigarettes, laughing as they did. A few glanced at me, puzzled. One woman slowed, recognition flickering across her face. "Aren't you—" she started. "I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. She nodded, confused, and walked away. Finally, my phone buzzed. "I'm sorry," Daniel wrote. "Marissa is really upset. She says she can't relax with you here. I'll explain later. Please go home." Go home. Not, "We'll talk now," not, "This is temporary," just, "Go." I stared at the message until the words blurred. In that moment, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet click like a lock turning inside my chest. I realized this wasn't about one night. This was about something much older, much deeper. I drove home in silence, the radio off, the road stretching endlessly ahead of me. My reflection in the windshield looked unfamiliar, older, harder, like someone who had finally run out of excuses. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was restless and thin. The next morning, my phone was still quiet. No call, no explanation. I made coffee I didn't drink and toast I didn't eat. The house felt too still. Every sound amplified. The hum of the fridge, the tick of the clock, the neighbor's dog barking somewhere far away. By afternoon, the shock had worn off, replaced by something sharper. Questions. I thought back over the past year, replaying conversations I'd dismissed, moments I'd brushed aside, the way Marissa always seemed irritated when Daniel mentioned me, how plans changed without explanation, how I'd slowly been moved from the center to the edges. Had this been happening longer than I realized? That evening, my cousin Lila called. "I didn't know what to say last night," she admitted softly. "I'm so sorry." "Do you know why?" I asked. There was a pause. "People were saying, Marissa told some folks you were controlling, that you didn't respect boundaries." I laughed, a short, humorless sound. "By helping with invitations?" "She said you made her feel judged, like you didn't think she was good enough for Daniel." My hand tightened around the phone. "I've never said that." "I know," Lila said, "but that's the story she's been telling." After we hung up, I sat very still. So that was it. Not a misunderstanding, a narrative. I thought of every time I'd swallowed my discomfort, every time I'd chosen peace over honesty. I assumed my love for Daniel would protect me. I was wrong. 2 days later, Daniel finally came by. He looked exhausted. The glow of the wedding had faded, replaced by dark circles and a tight jaw. He stood awkwardly in my doorway, like a guest instead of family. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. We sat at the kitchen table where he used to do homework, the same scratches in the wood, the same faint smell of coffee and soap. "She feels threatened by you," he said finally. I studied his face. "Do you?" He didn't answer right away. "She thinks you don't trust her, that you're always watching, evaluating." "Daniel," I said quietly, "I love you. That's all I've ever done." He rubbed his hands together. "I know, but she needs me to choose her." There it was. Not balance, not understanding. Choose. "And kicking me out was choosing her?" I asked. His silence was answer enough. I felt a strange calm settle over me. "All right," I said, "then be honest with me." He looked up. "Is this what you want, or is this what you're afraid to fight?" His eyes flickered, and for a second I saw the boy I'd raised, the one who hated conflict, who always bent to keep the peace. "I just want my marriage to work," he said. I nodded slowly. That was the moment I understood the real betrayal hadn't happened in the parking lot. It had been happening quietly, choice by choice, long before the wedding ever began, and I wasn't done uncovering the truth. After Daniel left, the house felt different. Not emptier, quieter in a way that pressed against my ears, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I didn't cry right away. I washed the 2 coffee mugs we'd used, even though only one of them had been touched. I wiped the counter, straightened the chair he'd pulled out, folded the dish towel with slow, careful hands. Old habits, the kind you cling to when your insides feel like loose threads. But later that night, when the lights were off and the world finally stopped asking anything of me, the tears came. They weren't loud. They didn't come with sobs or drama. They just slipped out, steady and hot, soaking into my pillow as I stared at the ceiling. I kept hearing Daniel's words. She needs me to choose her, as if love were a door that could only open one way. I turned onto my side and thought about all the times I had chosen him, without being asked, without keeping score. The nights I stayed up with him when he was sick, the weekends I skipped plans so he wouldn't feel alone, the way I'd shaped my life around being someone dependable. And now, somehow, that devotion had been turned into a flaw. The next morning, I woke with a dull ache behind my eyes and a resolve I didn't quite recognize. If there was a story being told about me, I needed to hear it in full. I started with people I trusted. Lila met me for coffee, her face already creased with concern before I even sat down. "They said you left early," she told me. "Marissa was crying, said you caused a scene." I almost laughed. I was escorted out by security. Her mouth fell open. She didn't say that. Of course she didn't. Over the next few days, bits and pieces surfaced, comments Marissa had made during dress fittings, little jokes at my expense that landed wrong, stories framed just carefully enough to paint me as overbearing, critical, too involved. She said you tried to control the guest list. She said you questioned her finances. She said you didn't like her family. Each one felt like a pinprick, small, precise, intentional. None of them were true. The worst part wasn't the lies themselves. It was how easily they'd been believed. I asked Daniel for specifics, for examples, for moments where I'd crossed a line. He couldn't give me any. "She just feels it," he kept saying. "You know how intuition is." I did know. I knew intuition could be shaped, fed, turned sharp if someone wanted it to be. The real discovery came a week later, completely by accident. I was going through old photos on my phone, trying to distract myself, when I noticed something odd. A message thread I didn't recognize, muted, archived, almost hidden. It was between Daniel and Marissa. I hesitated. My first instinct was to stop. Privacy mattered. Trust mattered. But trust, I was learning, had already been spent. I opened the thread. The messages went back months. At first, they were ordinary, wedding plans, errands, reminders. Then, slowly, the tone shifted. "Your sister makes me uncomfortable. She watches me like she's waiting for me to fail. I don't feel safe being myself around her." Daniel's replies were placating, gentle, avoidant. "She means well. She's just protective. She'll come around." Then came the turning point. If she's at the wedding the whole time, I don't think I can enjoy my own day. That message sat there plain as day. And below it, I need you to put us first. Daniel responded hours later. I'll handle it. My hands started to shake. Scrolling further, I saw messages sent the morning of the wedding. She's already here. I'm anxious. Please don't let her ruin this. And then one final line that made my stomach drop. If she won't leave willingly, you need to make her. I set the phone down like it had burned me. There it was. Not confusion, not stress, a decision. I didn't confront Daniel right away. I needed time to breathe, to think about who I was going to be in the face of this. Because anger is easy. Dignity is harder. When we finally spoke again, it was at his request. He came over, eyes wary, posture guarded. I know you're upset, he said. I slid my phone across the table. He stared at it. You went through my messages? He asked, hurt flashing across his face. Yes, I said simply. And now I know. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. She felt cornered, he said finally. I was trying to protect my marriage. And who was protecting me? I asked. He looked away. I didn't think it would go this far. But it did, I said, and you let it. His shoulders sagged. I didn't know how to say no to her. I know, I said. You never have. That landed harder than I expected. He flinched like I'd struck something tender. She made me the villain, I continued, my voice steady. And you let it. He swallowed. What do you want me to do now? It was a fair question. I thought about shouting, about demanding apologies, about forcing him to choose again. But I was tired. I want the truth to be told, I said. Not to hurt her, not to embarrass you, just no more lies. He hesitated. She won't like that, he said. I met his eyes. I didn't like being thrown out of my brother's wedding. He nodded slowly. That night, Daniel spoke to his parents, to a few close relatives. The story shifted just enough, not a full confession, but no longer a smear. Marissa didn't call me. She didn't apologize. Instead, she sent a message. I hope you can respect our boundaries moving forward. I read it 3 times. Then I put my phone down, because the truth was finally clear. This wasn't about boundaries. It was about control. And I was done shrinking myself to fit someone else's comfort. Daniel didn't cry in that lawyer's office. He wasn't the kind of man who allowed himself that release easily. But his voice changed. It lost its sharpness, its certainty. I thought I could fix it quietly, he said, staring at the carpet. If we secured the house, we could refinance, pay off the condo. Natalie wouldn't have to worry. Mom's hand remained wrapped around his. You should have told me you were struggling, she said gently. He shook his head. I didn't want to look irresponsible. After everything you and Clara did for me, I didn't want to ask for help again. There it was. Not entitlement, pride. And pride has a way of disguising itself as practicality. I stayed quiet for a long moment before speaking. Daniel, I said softly, I would have helped you. He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time since the wedding, there wasn't accusation in his eyes, just exhaustion. But Natalie said you'd judge us, he admitted. She said you think she's after the house. I exhaled slowly. I never thought she was after the house, I said. I thought she was moving too fast. There's a difference. The lawyer cleared his throat again. Mrs. Reynolds, he said gently, it might be wise to pause any structural changes for now. You can always revisit them later. Mom nodded. Yes, she whispered. Pause. Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly. He wasn't defeated. He was relieved. But relief doesn't fix consequences. The fallout didn't end there. When Natalie found out Daniel had admitted their financial strain and that Mom had decided to revise the will again, she didn't take it quietly. She came to Mom's house that evening alone. I was there too, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I hadn't touched. Natalie didn't sit down. She remained standing, arms folded, posture straight as a blade. "So this is what you wanted," she said to me. I didn't rise to the tone. "What I wanted," I replied calmly, "was honesty." She laughed softly, not amused but incredulous. "You humiliated Daniel," she said. "He humiliated me first, at his wedding." She blinked, momentarily thrown off. "That was about boundaries." "No," I said, "that was about exclusion." Mom spoke then, her voice firmer than I'd heard it in weeks. "Natalie, I will not be divided from my daughter." Her jaw tightened. "I'm not dividing anyone. I'm protecting my husband." "From what?" I asked gently. Her answer came too quickly. "From being manipulated." The irony hung in the air like smoke. I studied her carefully then. For the first time, I didn't see a villain. I saw a woman who had built her identity around control, around never appearing unstable or uncertain. Financial strain threatened that image, and instead of admitting vulnerability, she tried to engineer security. The problem was, she engineered it without consent. "Why didn't you just ask?" I asked her quietly. She hesitated. Because asking would have meant admitting weakness, and weakness for someone like Natalie was intolerable. "I won't apologize for planning ahead," she said finally. "No one is asking you to, but planning without transparency breaks trust." Daniel arrived halfway through the conversation. He walked in, looked at Natalie, then at me. The tension between them was visible, subtle but real. "Nat, we need to slow down," he said softly. Her eyes widened. "You're taking their side?" "You're taking the truth's side," he replied. That landed hard. She looked between us, at Mom's trembling hands, at my steady posture, at Daniel's tired expression, and something in her shifted. Not surrender, but realization. "You should have told me you couldn't afford the condo," I said to Daniel gently. Natalie's eyes snapped toward him. He swallowed. "We both knew," he said quietly. The silence that followed was different, not defensive, heavy, because now the truth wasn't about inheritance, it was about choices made together, and choices hidden. The public consequence came in small ripples. Family friends who had whispered before began hearing a different story, not because I defended myself loudly, but because Mom did. At church one Sunday, when a neighbor mentioned wedding drama, Mom smiled politely and said, "There was no drama. There was confusion, and we resolved it." That was all. But it shifted the tone. Daniel began coming by the house again, alone at first. He helped Mom fix the leaky faucet Dad had never gotten around to repairing. We didn't pretend everything was fine, but we sat at the same table again. One evening, as we washed dishes side by side, he spoke quietly. "I was ashamed," I said quietly. "I shouldn't have asked you to leave." "No," I agreed gently. "You shouldn't have." He looked at me then, eyes glossy. "I'm sorry." It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, but it was real, and real apologies matter. Natalie took longer. She didn't return to Mom's house for nearly a month. When she did, she brought flowers, not as a peace offering, she wasn't that sentimental, but as an acknowledgement. We spoke politely, carefully. Boundaries had been drawn, not to exclude, but to protect clarity. Daniel and Natalie eventually decided to sell the condo themselves and downsize to something more manageable. It wasn't easy. It required compromise. It required humility. But it was theirs, not built on someone else's leverage. Months later, Mom finalized her will. Equal division. No hidden clauses, no immediate control shifts. She also added something unexpected, a letter to both of us. It would be opened only after she was gone. Just in case, she said softly. I didn't ask what it said. Some things don't need to be known in advance. What mattered was that the house and what it represented was no longer a weapon. It was simply home again. And as for Daniel's wedding day, the sting didn't disappear overnight. There are memories that never quite soften fully, but they can transform. That day taught me something I hadn't wanted to learn. Love without boundaries invites resentment, and silence, even when well-intentioned, allows misunderstanding to grow teeth. I didn't lose my brother, but I nearly did, and the cost of almost losing him was the clarity we all needed.
The thing about truth is that it doesn't rush. It waits. It sits quietly in corners and half-finished sentences and sideways glances until enough people have felt the weight of it pressing on their own conscience. And then, one day, it stands up on its own. I didn't announce anything. I didn't gather the family for a reckoning. I didn't post vague messages online or share screenshots. But the consequences still came. They came in the form of uncomfortable pauses when my name was mentioned. They came when Marissa corrected someone a little too sharply, or when Daniel looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. They came when people started noticing patterns. At a holiday dinner, Marissa snapped at Daniel over something small, napkins, I think. The table went quiet. Someone tried to laugh it off, but the air stayed heavy. Later, my aunt leaned over to me and whispered, "She's intense, isn't she?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. At another gathering, a cousin asked Daniel, kindly, casually, why I hadn't been invited. He hesitated. That hesitation spoke louder than any explanation. The public consequence wasn't humiliation. It wasn't punishment. It was exposure. Not of private messages or secret schemes, but of character. I watched from a distance as Daniel grew more withdrawn. He laughed less. He checked his phone more. When he spoke, it was careful, measured, like someone afraid of stepping on the wrong word. Once, when he thought no one was listening, I heard him say, "I just don't want another fight." That sentence followed me home, because I recognized it. It was the same sentence I'd lived by for years. The turning point came at a family barbecue the following summer. Nothing dramatic, no raised voices, just heat, smoke, and too many people crowded into one backyard. Marissa arrived late, already irritated. Daniel trailed behind her, carrying bags, apologizing to no one in particular. I kept my distance, chatting with relatives, helping in the kitchen, refilling drinks. I wasn't avoiding them, I was simply existing. At some point, a well-meaning relative said, "It's so nice seeing everyone together again." Marissa stiffened. "Well," she said a little too brightly, "not everyone makes that easy." The words hung there. Every head turned. I felt it then, that familiar pull to explain, to soften, to save everyone from discomfort. I didn't. I sipped my drink and waited. Daniel cleared his throat. "That's not fair," he said quietly. Marissa looked at him shocked. "Excuse me?" "That's not fair," he repeated, louder this time. "She hasn't done anything." My heart started to pound. This wasn't a grand declaration, it wasn't heroic, but it was public, and it mattered. Marissa laughed sharply. "So now you're taking her side?" "I'm taking the truth side," he said. Silence fell like a dropped plate. No one cheered, no one clapped, but something shifted. Marissa excused herself shortly after, her smile brittle, her eyes flashing with something I couldn't quite name. Anger, fear, maybe both. Daniel stayed. He didn't come over to me right away, he didn't apologize publicly, but when he did approach later, his voice was low and unsteady. I should have stopped it from the beginning. I nodded. Yes, you should have. He swallowed. I'm trying to fix things. I know, I said, and I meant it. Fixing doesn't always look like repair. Sometimes it looks like reckoning. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began setting small boundaries. He corrected false statements. He stopped allowing jokes at my expense. He no longer asked me to stay quiet for the sake of harmony. It cost him. Marissa grew colder, more distant. Their arguments became harder to hide. The image of the perfect newlywed couple cracked around the edges. People noticed, not because I pointed it out, but because reality has a way of making itself known. One afternoon, Daniel called me, voice raw. She says you're turning everyone against her. I closed my eyes. I haven't said anything. I know. That's the problem. That's when I realized something important. When someone builds their sense of safety on controlling a narrative, silence becomes a threat. I wasn't punishing her. I wasn't exposing her. I was simply no longer participating in a lie. The family didn't exile her. They didn't take sides loudly or dramatically. They just adjusted. Conversations became more cautious around her. Invitations became more neutral. Trust, once cracked, didn't fully return. And that was the consequence. Not cruelty, not revenge, just the natural result of actions meeting daylight. As for me, I found my footing again. I wasn't everyone's favorite anymore, but I was respected. I wasn't central to every plan, but I wasn't erased either. And that balance, hard-earned, imperfect, felt like justice. One evening, Daniel came by alone. He looked older than his years, his shoulders heavier. I don't know what the future looks like, he admitted. I don't either, I said. He met my eyes. But I know I was wrong. I let that settle between us. Not everything needs to be forgiven immediately. Not everything needs to be resolved neatly. Sometimes the most powerful consequence is simply being seen clearly by others and by yourself. And in that clarity, healing begins.
Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in small, almost unnoticeable moments. When you realize your chest doesn't tighten at the sound of a name anymore, or when a memory surfaces and it no longer feels like a bruise you have to protect. For me, healing began the day I stopped waiting for an apology that might never come. I had spent months imagining it, Marissa showing up at my door, eyes lowered, voice soft, admitting she'd gone too far. Daniel standing beside her, finally choosing courage over comfort. The words, "I'm sorry," spoken plainly, without conditions. But life rarely delivers closure wrapped in neat sentences. So I made a different choice. I let go of the version of the ending that required them to change before I could breathe again. Instead, I focused on changing how much space the hurt occupied inside me. I started with my home. I rearranged furniture that hadn't moved in years, let light into rooms I'd kept dim out of habit. I donated clothes I'd worn to events where I'd felt invisible, keeping only the ones that felt like me. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out a drawer, I found the blue dress I'd worn to the wedding. The lace was still creased at the knees. I held it up for a long time, fingers tracing the fabric, remembering the sound of the doors closing behind me, the way the night air had felt like a verdict. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in a box, not in the trash, not back in the closet. Some things aren't meant to be erased. They're meant to be acknowledged, then set aside. My relationship with Daniel didn't return to what it had been. It couldn't. But it became something quieter, more honest. We spoke less often, but when we did, there was no pretending, no forced cheer.
no asking me to make myself smaller for the sake of peace. Once, during a walk in the park, he said, "I didn't realize how much you carried for me." I stopped walking. "I didn't either," I said. That was the truth. For years, I had worn responsibility like a second skin, being the strong one, the reliable one, the one who didn't need much in return. Letting go of that role felt like learning to breathe differently. As for Marissa, we existed in the same family orbit without orbiting each other. Polite, distant, neutral. She never apologized. I never asked her to. Sometimes I caught her watching me, not with hostility, but with something closer to uncertainty, as if she wasn't sure what power I still held now that I wasn't fighting for it. I realized then that I no longer needed her acknowledgement to validate my experience. I had already validated myself. The real healing came in how I showed up for my own life. I said no without explanations. I spoke when something didn't sit right, even if my voice trembled. I allowed myself to want things without justifying them. And slowly, the story of that wedding night loosened its grip. It became something I could tell without reliving, a chapter, not the whole book. One evening, while sitting alone on my porch, I thought about how close I'd come to disappearing quietly, to becoming the family member people spoke about in past tense with a shrug and a sigh. She was always so helpful. She meant well. Things just got complicated. But I hadn't disappeared. I had stayed. Not in the room where I was unwanted, but in myself. That, I realized, was the real victory. I didn't win anyone over. I didn't reclaim a role that had cost me too much. I reclaimed my sense of worth, and with it came a gentler understanding of family, not as something you endure at any cost, but as something that should make room for your full humanity. There are still days when it aches, when I see photos I'm not in, when I remember the sound of music muffled by closed doors. But those days pass. What remains is steadier, a quiet confidence, a knowing. I can love without losing myself. I can forgive without forgetting. I can walk away from what diminishes me and still hold compassion in my hands. That's the lesson my brother's wedding taught me, one I never asked for, but one I carry with grace now. There's one more piece of this story I haven't told you, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. And sometimes the quiet parts are where the real change lives. About 2 years after the wedding, Mom decided to downsize on her own terms, not because of pressure, not because of clauses in legal documents, but because the stairs had become harder on her knees and the garden, Dad's beloved garden, required more tending than she could comfortably give. The day she told us, we were sitting at the kitchen table again, the same table where the will had first been spread out like a battlefield map. "I think it's time," she said gently. "I want something smaller, closer to town." Daniel looked startled. "You don't have to," he said quickly. "I know. That's why I can." That sentence stayed with me. That's why I can. Choice feels different when it isn't cornered. This time, there were no hidden meetings, no rushed paperwork on celebration days. We sat together, the three of us, and talked through options. Natalie even offered to help research properties. And I watched closely, not out of suspicion anymore, but habit. There's a difference. Suspicion searches for betrayal. Awareness simply stays awake. The house eventually sold at a fair price through a transparent process. The money was divided exactly as Mom had finalized in her will months before. Equal, clear, honest. The day we handed over the keys, Daniel walked through the empty living room slowly. Sunlight streamed across the hardwood floors, catching dust in the air like tiny floating memories. "I almost lost this place," he said quietly. "You almost lost more than that," I replied gently. He nodded. "I know." There was no defensiveness in him now, just understanding. We stepped outside together. The wind chime rang softly one last time. I reached up and unhooked it. "You're taking that?" Daniel asked. "Yes," I said. "Some things belong with both of us." He didn't argue. Mom moved into a small 2-bedroom cottage near the park. It had wide windows and a little porch just big enough for 2 rocking chairs. It wasn't the house we grew up in, but it was peaceful. And peace, I've learned, is not about square footage, it's about clarity. One afternoon, months after the move, I found myself alone on Mom's new porch. The air smelled like freshly cut grass. Children's laughter drifted faintly from the nearby playground. Daniel arrived unexpectedly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me and sat down. "You ever think about that day?" he asked quietly. "The wedding?" I said. He nodded. "Yes," I answered honestly. "Sometimes." He stared out at the park. "I was so sure I was right, so sure you were against me." I took a slow sip of coffee. Fear makes enemies out of the wrong people. He exhaled softly. "I wish I could redo it." I shook my head gently. "If you redo it, you don't learn it." He looked at me sideways. "You always talk like that," he said, half smiling. "Like what?" "Like you're narrating a life lesson." I laughed quietly. "Maybe I am." He grew serious again. "You didn't just protect Mom, you protected me from becoming someone I wouldn't respect." That hit deeper than he probably realized, because that had been my quiet fear. Not losing the house, not losing money, losing the version of my brother I believed in. He continued, "You did the hard thing. You stayed." I thought about that word, stayed. I could have walked away after that wedding. I could have said, "If that's how you see me, then fine." But walking away would have been easier than standing firm, and easier doesn't always mean right. "I stayed because you're my brother," I said simply, "but I also stayed because I respect myself." He nodded slowly. That balance, love and self-respect, took years for me to understand. When you sacrifice one for the other, resentment grows, but when you hold both, something steadier forms. If you ask me now what that wedding taught me, I won't say it taught me about betrayal. It taught me about boundaries. It taught me that silence can look like peace, but often it's just avoidance wearing polite clothes. It taught me that even good people can make selfish decisions when they're scared. And it taught me that you don't have to shout to be strong. Sometimes strength is simply refusing to move when someone tries to push you out. That day in the church hallway, I felt discarded, humiliated, unwanted. But today, when I think about it, I see a different picture. I see a woman holding her father's cufflinks in her palm, choosing dignity over drama. I see a sister who didn't let anger rewrite her character. And I see a family that bent under pressure but didn't break. Not because we were perfect, but because eventually we chose honesty over control. And that choice changed everything.